lectures and asking me to speak. I think about 20 minutes should be okay? 15, 20 minutes?
At least 20 minutes.
All right. It's very nice to have a chair who doesn't specify that he's going to stop you after so many minutes. After Professor Bharti's very wide-ranging discussion, I'll be bringing the focus back to a narrower level, I think, and talk a little bit about Marx's work and how it has to be developed for today's world. Because I would say today what I've said many, many times, that Marx's own intellectual project was left incomplete, because he sets out his own intellectual project. I'll read out what he meant to do. But of course, he could not complete it, and how much can one expect one individual to do? A person who was dogged by financial problems, by his own ill health, by the death of 4 of his 7 children in his own lifetime. So it is remarkable that he did do what he actually did and left us this legacy, this amazing legacy of very rigorous analytical exposition of the basis of exploitation and of the way forward to human liberation. Marx spent the first 31 years of his life up to 1849. I didn't write this paper for this conference, but it happens to be an unpublished paper, so I'll read out a bit and talk a bit. He spent the first 31 years of his life up to 1849 in various European cities, engaged in developing his critique of idealist philosophy and writing for short-lived socialist journals. Hounded by censorship and by state persecution, he moved along with Engels to London in the summer of 1849 and lived there for the rest of his life, passing away in 1883, a few weeks before his 65th birthday. So during the period that Marx and Engels were formulating their path-breaking analysis of class exploitation and accumulation as the core reality of capitalism, they lived in Britain, which was the first country in the world to undergo capitalist industrialization and the center of the largest colonial empire of the time, which completely dwarfed the possessions of rival European nations. Yet, the other reality of the impact of the possession of colonies on metropolitan accumulation and industrial development was not addressed in his writings on political economy, neither in a contribution to the critique of political economy published in 1859, nor in Capital Volume 1 published in 1867. As we know, the second and third volumes of Capital were edited by Engels from manuscripts and published long after the first volume, Volume 2 in 1885 and Volume 3 in 1894, over a decade after Marx's death. And with all due respect to Professor Bharti, I will reiterate that the rigorous formal model of capitalist accumulation that Marx developed in the 3 volumes of Capital deals entirely with a closed economy, and international trade does not figure in it, nor does colonialism, other than many descriptive passages on slavery and many references to colonial loot and plunder. Now, it is not that Marx did not know about colonialism or did not know about the drain of wealth. All one is saying is that he had a formal model, and it was not integrated in these 3 volumes into his model, but he intended to integrate it, which he never got around to doing. It is this fact which has given rise to the almost complete ignoring of colonialism and imperialism in the present-day northern tradition of Marx's writings, most of which engages in a completely mechanical and purely textual interpretation of Marx's main works. That is, they treat what Marx has left us rather in the way a kind of devotee would treat the Bible or the Vedas. They're treated as kind of the final word, which cannot be developed further, which is not a very Marxist position to take in intellectual work. But 2 facts make it clear that Marx was very well aware of colonial exploitation, and even towards the end of his life, of the drain of wealth, which Prabhat has already referred to. First, in his articles contributed to the New York Daily Tribune that commented on and analyzed current events, Marx very frequently referred to Britain's exploitation of India, and he also referred clearly to the drain of wealth in this letter to Danielson written a mere 2 years before his death. I'll quote from that letter that Prabhat had mentioned. His extremely insightful writings on India and his contributions to the New York Daily Tribune have been available in the book On Colonialism from Progress Publishers, Moscow, and a recent collection has been put together under the title Marx on India, edited by Iqbal Hussain, with an introduction by Irfan Habib. So I think these are essential books to possess. Secondly, if we study Marx's intellectual project as he himself summarized it in his preface to his 1859 book, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, it becomes very clear that Marx never meant his analysis to remain confined to a closed economy, and he fully intended to study the global working of capitalism under the topics of the state, foreign trade, and world market. Marx says the following, and I'm quoting from his preface: I examine the system of bourgeois economy in the following order: capital, landed property, wage labor, semicolon. The state, foreign trade, and world market. Please note these last three topics: the state, foreign trade, the world market, which he never managed to actually complete. The economic conditions of existence of the three great classes into which modern bourgeois society is divided are analyzed under the first three headings. That is, capital, landed property, wage labor. The interconnection of the other three headings is self-evident. In practice, however, Marx could not complete his stated intellectual project. The first three topics took up the remainder of his entire working life, and this was carried out within a formally closed capitalist system without external trade. Marx's seminal contribution as regards understanding the meaning of exploitation under capitalism was to demonstrate that although the worker appeared to get the full reward for his labor in the form of a market wage for a day worked, this wage embodied only the necessary labor required to reproduce his life and the life of his family, because social reproduction is what he was talking about, and this is where the unpaid labor of women comes in, because the social reproduction of labor has to include, the wage has to cover also the requirements of the family. The necessary labor required to reproduce his life and that of his family for a day, and this was only part of the working day, the remaining part being surplus labor, whose product was appropriated as surplus value by the capitalist. The important thing here is that there's a market transaction of wage payment for labor, which appeared to be an exchange of equivalence. And this masks the reality of the appropriation of surplus labor by the capitalist in the form of surplus value. Now, once it is explained, it appears very simple. But don't forget that there's enormous confusion still in economic literature on this basic point. What is the source of surplus value under capitalism? There was, however, another form of exploitation which was extremely important for capitalist accumulation from the beginning in today's advanced countries, but whose nature was never clearly explicated. And I would say this remains the case to this day. That is not rigorously explained. And this was the exploitation of the subjugated peasants and workers in the colonies. The crucial point here was that the colonizing power obtained the right of extracting economic surplus. In India, for example, it was Britain's right of collecting taxes from 1765, when the company acquired the Diwani of Bengal, with the taxes on land, that is land revenue, being the most important, supplemented by indirect taxes. The peasant, in other countries, of course, it was different. In the Caribbean, surplus was extracted in the form of slave rent. In Ireland, that Professor Bhakti was referring to, extraction of surplus after Britain took over was in a combination of land rent and taxes. The peasant in India either paid tax directly or paid rent to the landlord, who in turn paid tax to the state. A very large part of these taxes, making up the budgetary revenues, was set aside as expenditure abroad. Now, this item doesn't occur in any sovereign country. It is peculiar to colonial exploitation that you set aside up to 1/3 of total budgetary revenues for what is called expenditure abroad. The items under this included the home charges, etc., interest on debt incurred in wars outside India, all payable in sterling, and all charged to the Indian budget. This part of the revenues was used by the government for buying export goods from the very same peasants and workers who had paid in the taxes in the first place. So I see a parallel, because although the peasants appeared to be paid for their products, since cash was being exchanged for their output at the market price, they were not actually paid, because this cash came out of their own tax contribution. So the whole process of exploitation, colonial exploitation, was obfuscated in the same manner as capitalist appropriation of surplus value had been obfuscated earlier, as long as you treated the wage as a reward, a full reward to labor. But this particular form of obfuscation has not really been clearly explained. That is the colonial form of obfuscation. So all that was happening in India during the colonial period is that a very large part of their own tax contribution was made to change its form from cash to goods for export to the world, whose international earnings were taken by Britain. And here I would also mention that we have been subject to the intellectual hegemony of theories which are completely logically wrong, such as Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which assumes that both countries produce both goods in his model, but actually assumed that all countries produce all goods, which is materially incorrect. I mean, if you ask yourself the question, why did the handful of maritime European nations, that is Portugal, Spain, France, Netherlands, Britain, not all European nations, but just a handful of maritime nations, come all across the world to subjugate tropical areas like ours? The answer is obvious, because they wanted access to products that they could not ever produce themselves. And this is where agriculture is very different from any other branch of production. And this desire to access our lands is very important to understand, because the climate has not miraculously changed. This imperative drive of which are today advanced, located in cold temperate lands, to access the productive capacity, the higher productive capacity of tropical lands, which can produce crops all the year round and produce additional crops that the advanced countries cannot produce at all. This is as true today as it was. So when we are talking about colonial exploitation, it is not something which is in history. The basic underlying economic reasons for it persist to this day. And yet we are completely blinded to the material reality of this, because in our own university, in our own center CESP, we completely uncritically teach students Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, denying our own history and telling them that there is mutual benefit from trade, when actually there was no mutual benefit. There was colonial exploitation which led to famine and to hunger, because even though our lands are more productive, we cannot both feed today's advanced capitalist countries and maintain our own population's food security. So this is why it is so important to understand what colonial exploitation was, because if we don't understand it, we do not understand what neo-imperialism today was. So I don't really have much time to expand. I think I did? Okay. So let me carry on for a little while order. Now, because they could not ever produce the goods that Britain extracted from India, or France extracted from the Caribbean and Indochina, or Netherlands extracted from Java, these goods actually represented for the colonizing power international purchasing power. Because the other countries in Europe, which did not themselves have colonies, were very eager consumers of these goods. So it had a very ready market abroad. Of course, every bit of the international purchasing power that our peasants and workers produced under colonialism was appropriated by the metropolis. When the East India Company was ruling, the appropriation was very direct and simple. It simply took out goods, exported goods, buying those goods out of taxes it collected, so its own outlays became zero, which meant that its own profit rate went up to dizzying heights, because unlike any other trader, it had to make no outlay at all on purchasing these goods. They simply got it out of taxes. And not only that, it benefited the colonizing power as a macroeconomy, because the import surplus that Britain had from India, for example, which persisted right up to the late 1840s, did not have to be paid for. It created no external liability for Britain, because the producers had been so-called paid already out of their own taxes, therefore they had not been paid at all. All that had happened was that a portion of the taxes extracted from them had been converted into export goods, which gave Britain the possibility of re-exporting these goods. And I'll tell you something very interesting here, continuing with this critique of the kind of fallacious theories and estimates that we teach and continue to teach. I regret to say in JNU today. So we have to, be aware of what we teach and how wrong it is. That the leading economic historians of Britain, Phyllis Dean and W.A. Cole, who wrote this book called British Economic Growth, Trends and Structure, give you an estimate of British trade which is actually conceptually wrong. It's very interesting because Phyllis Dean, in her book The First Industrial Revolution, actually said that re-exports of tropical goods, or re-exports generally, 80% of which were tropical goods, was very important for Britain, allowing it to purchase commodities that it lacked from European countries and North America. Bar iron, timber, pitch and tar, strategic commodities. Now when you come to Dean and Cole's book, which is published 2 years later, the entire discussion on re-exports is cut out. It doesn't figure anymore. And moreover, they cut out re-exports completely from their estimate of British trade, which is wrong. Because if you look at the definition of trade which is used in any open economy, macroeconomics textbook, the definition of trade which is applied by international organizations like the World Bank, by the UNCTAD and so on, by the IMF, that definition says that a country's trade is total exports plus total imports. And they are taking only the imports retained within Britain and the exports of domestically produced British goods. So please make a note of this. They give you a wrong series of volume of British trade. I reworked that series and I found for the entire 18th century to the early 19th century, and I found that by 1800, the actual trade that Britain had was 82 million pounds. Dean and Cole give you a figure of 51 million pounds. The actual trade GDP ratio that Britain had was 56% of GDP. Dean and Cole give you the figure of 34%. So why should we continue to teach this uncritically? And this is the problem with even our left-wing economists and historians and so on, that we are so completely hegemonized by the fallacious theories like Ricardo's theory or by wrong estimates which emanate from northern universities. We never look at it critically and ask the question, is this correct? We never try to rework it. We simply take whatever the textbooks tell us to do. So one purpose of my telling you all this is that I would suggest that never accept anything unquestioningly. No matter how important the person is, how important the academic is, maybe a Nobel laureate, but as Aristotle told us long ago, we should not suffer from the fallacy of being in awe. There's a certain type of fallacy which arises when we accept propositions because we are in awe of somebody. When, if I criticize Professor Amartya Sen, people say, who are you? He's a Nobel laureate. Now that is not a correct academic argument. He could be a wonderful economist, but it's perfectly possible for him to put forward a particular argument which is not logically correct. Similarly, if people say, who are you to criticize Ricardo? As a matter of fact, one of our own students did so in a seminar when I first put forward my critique of Ricardo. So what is this attack on Ricardo? As it was saying, who are you to criticize somebody who is recognized as a pioneer? No. I am perfectly justified in criticizing a wrong argument, no matter who's making it. And you are also justified in doing so. So, this abnormal use of taxes converted to international purchasing power and taken by the ruling country was the essence of the drain of wealth from Britain's most lucrative colony, India. It was first pointed out by those brilliant Indian pioneers, Dadabhai Nauroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt, but the mechanism of the drain has not been understood properly. Nor was the drain ever mentioned by modern Marxists from northern academia, with one or two honorable exceptions. Again, you read Eric Hobsbawm, who is a Marxist, there is not a single mention of any bit of Indian literature on the drain of wealth. There is nothing on colonial exploitation at all. So I would say that a number of those who call themselves Marxist economists in northern universities, according to me, are not Marxists at all. Because if you do not, because they simply take the text of Marx without understanding that Marx himself would never ever have confined himself to not analyzing very rigorously what the essence of colonial exploitation was. Had he lived for another 30 years, he would have done so, definitely. And he was not Eurocentric. When Marx found that the possibilities of revolution in Britain and in Europe generally had receded, and why had they receded? Marx was perfectly correct in saying that capitalist accumulation produces wealth at one pole and poverty and misery at the other pole. He has been criticized by later scholars saying that, look at the way that the working class in Europe has raised its standard of living. So Marx was wrong in his prediction. Marx was not wrong. Marx was perfectly correct, provided we do not take his theory as being applicable to national economies confined to Europe or North America alone, but provided we apply his theory to the global operation of capitalism, including colonialism. Then he was perfectly correct to say that capitalist accumulation at one pole, that is the pole that happened to be located in what we call today's advanced capitalist world, necessarily produced misery, poverty and degradation at the other pole. That pole which is located in today's developing countries, the today's ex-colonized world. Okay? But this generalization is very, very essential, and it is because they do not even understand the mechanism of colonial exploitation that a number of so-called Marxists in northern universities who are greatly lionized, who are greatly quoted, simply do not understand what imperialism was or is today. Okay. Now, let me just quickly wind up now, because I've been talking, I think, for a best part of 20 minutes, by saying, just giving you this quote that Prabhat referred to. In Marx's, just for 2-3 minutes, then I'll wind up. In Marx's writings on India contributed to the New York Daily Tribune, we find a very clear discussion in many places of the deindustrializing effects on India of the imports of cotton yarn and cloth from England. Marx wrote in detail on the discriminating policy England followed by banning from 1700 the consumption of Asian textiles within the country, the profitable re-export of Indian textiles mainly to Europe, however, was carried out by the company, while the Indian market was kept completely open to imports. There are very long passages in which Marx discusses deindustrialization. Marx gives valuable statistics from official sources which indicate that by the late 1840s, India's export surplus with Britain disappeared as imports poured into the deliberately unprotected Indian market. Of course, India's export surplus with the rest of the world was rising fast, and it was the earnings of this global export surplus that Britain appropriated for itself. By the way, these export surplus earnings were huge. We have very detailed data from a 1960 online matrix of global trade from the United Nations, which nobody else, I think, has analyzed. But if you look at that data, we find that India was earning the second highest export surplus from all over the world. In fact, 2/3 of its earnings was coming from the continental Europe and North America by the 1920s, the second highest. The highest was United States, and not a single penny, not a single pound of these export surplus earnings were allowed to come back to the country. They all disappeared into the account of the Secretary of State for India in London. And what the Secretary of State did was to issue bills of exchange called council bills, which were sent to India by the foreign importers of Indian goods. They had paid in their gold and sterling and Deutschmarks and francs to the Secretary of State. They got these bills cashable only in rupees. They were sent to India. The Indian exporters cash. So you can imagine the scale of exploitation that was involved. Well, I have a very crude estimate of total drain of wealth from India from 1765 to 1938, compounding it at 5% interest rate, and I find it comes to 9.2 trillion pounds sterling, which at the exchange rate prevalent for most of the time amounts to about 45 trillion US dollars. Not billion, but trillion, 45 trillion US dollars. Okay. So it is huge, it was really huge. Getting back to Marx, As Prabhat said, and I'd just like to quote that passage because it's so interesting. In this letter to Danielson, which he wrote only 2 years before his death. By the way, what he's saying in this passage, in this letter to Danielson, he had not said anywhere before this. I quote, "In India, serious complications, if not a general outbreak, is in store for the British government. What the English take from them annually, in the form of rent, dividends, for railways useless to the Hindus, pensions for military and civil service,